God's Favorite Marble. A comprehensive history of a species' contingency with the divine. Let us pick a point on the timeline and start from there. In the beginning, there was a marble, and it was God's. This particular marble was of interest to the historical record because it was the creator's favorite marble, a veritable masterwork of glasswork artistry. The marble was a triumph, a true magnum opus. Perfectly round, perfectly hard, transparent and crystalline, with the billowing depths of a great nebula within its rounded wall. It is said that the toy was so beautiful that God could spend eons at a time gazing upon it, staring into its swirling pools of light without so much as a blink. One might say that God only had eyes for marbles at the time, having gathered a collection of several billion of the shiny little orbs, in addition to declaring a rest day each week to have time to build elaborate tube contraptions through which to drop them. In my estimation, marbles may have mattered more to God than all the sentient souls of the myriad cosmos. God constructed a great palace for his favorite marble, complete with shimmering gold halls, a pedestal of chiseled quartz, and a vast empty space below, so that the framing of the light and contrast of the shadows would always dance upon the orb at the perfect angles. The marble sat comfortably upon a red velveteen pillow in this palace for 3 eternities from the time it was created. That is, until it didn't. To this day, it is unknown how exactly the marble came to fall into the great space below. At the time of writing, there are still whispers amongst some cherubim that the once great Lucifer thought it a prank to flick the toy from its pedestal, perhaps explaining his banishment sometime later. The archangels, ever eager to distance themselves from the fallen one, have offered a rebuke, claiming that a lackadaisical cherub janitor must have tripped, knocking the little sphere into the abyss of uncreation. Unfortunately, the historiography is woefully sparse, as the matter is generally kept very hush-hush. Politics aside, we know for a fact that the marble did indeed fall into the cosmos, soon followed by God's jealous eye. What happened next was an altogether fascinating chain of causation worthy of its own chapter in the heavenly canon. A story which I have taken up the task of recording for posterity. There has been a great deal of confusion and misinformation surrounding the beginning of the universe. While it is widely agreed upon that a world's existence is indicative of some sort of cosmology, mortals have never been able to pin down the exact mythos. I've read reports as outlandish as giant dragons, murderous demigods, and a very big turtle, all potential culprits in the mystery of creation. Obviously, these stories are mostly ridiculous and unfounded fairy tales, though I must applaud the mortal's capacity for creativity. While most would agree that these ideas are ludicrous, they would also concur that God had some form of reason for sparking the beginning of creation. After all, perfect divinity implies perfect intent. That said, as a historian, I am compelled to bear witness to the truth, one which is entirely unexpected, even compared to the accounts I've mentioned. Therefore, I'll do my due diligence to set the record straight and lay the problem of creation out bare. As you might have guessed, the answer is in fact marble adjacent. God desperately desired to retrieve his favorite marble. Given the conditions, this was not the simplest task of finding a needle in a haystack. That would be far too facile for the likes of an almighty being. The feat might be more comparable to finding a single quark within the totality of material reality, or perhaps a drop of water in an endless ocean. God was presented with multiple problems on this front. For one, the expanse of space into which the toy had dropped was infinite, and two, was completely shrouded in darkness. Discovering that a lantern was insufficient to traverse the abyss, God concluded that a radiance far more brilliant would be necessary if he ever wished to succeed. He reasoned that the only way to feasibly accomplish this was by rubbing atoms together. In this way, it came to be that God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was on, and that it was good, for light distinguished between what was and was not a marble. However, in so doing, God had also accidentally created the first matter, for in the space of a single fusion reaction, all of existence had appeared. Unfortunately, this meant that he now had to find his marble, essentially a tiny rock, in an enormous sea of other tiny rocks. God sorted through rocks for 6 days and 6 nights, before it finally came time to play with his other marbles on the 7th day. Then God saw that it was bad and resolved to renounce his favorite marble, leaving behind the sarcophagus which had caged his prized possession. Thus, from an origin of unity, there was entropy, and from entropy, probability. A universe was born. For mortal readers, the vast scale of cosmological time can sometimes be difficult to exactly pin down. In space, quantities of time and distance are not measured in rotations of a planet or even revolutions around a star. Rather, the universal speed of light becomes the new metric, as objects are so distant from one another that even the most energetic photons struggle to bridge tiny gaps. In this vast context, objects seem to stand still for eons, even if they are traveling at hundreds of thousands of leagues per second. To say the marble's progress through this bright, new universe was slow, therefore, is far more than an understatement. According to my calculations, the marble could have made contact with its eventual destination much earlier if its trajectory were uninterrupted. However, I estimate that the marble made a few billion-year pit stops along its route, the vast majority of which was probably spent aimlessly floating in the vacuum of space. It is conceivable that the marble might have found itself encased in the ice of a frozen planet, or trapped orbiting an orange star for a time, though I have no data to back this up. Inevitably, planets explode and stars whittle down, freeing the little orb on its path to the Milky Way. On its journey, the marble would have witnessed the most miraculous sights that any young cosmos could offer. The birth of stars, the multicolored pillars of grand nebulae, the searing heat of a vast supernova. I often wonder what stories the little toy might tell if given life, and find myself dearly wishing I were in its place. All the same, after roughly 9 billion years of sojourning, the toy finally came to rest on a planet that would come to be known as Terra. Admittedly, calling the following series of misadventures a rest does the escapade a disservice for several reasons. First and foremost, the violent manner with which the marble impacted the planet, traveling at nearly half the speed of light. The force of collision was reportedly so massive that it kicked clouds of dust into the atmosphere that would block out the sun for years, plunging Terra into an ice age. However, there is also the second and far more interesting reason. Terra was a rare, albeit flourishing, home to life in the galaxy, and this significant change to the planet's climate would predicate first contact between sentient mortals and the divine. In fact, so much occurred to the marble in the tiny period that followed that 1 million libraries worth of books could probably be written on the subject. But for the moment, the marble found itself buried in a reservoir deep underground, quietly awaiting a return to the surface and to the stars once more. The marble's trail picks up again roughly 66 million years later in a land called Canaan. From what we know now, a series of complex underground rivers and aquifers had gradually pushed the orb up from its residence within the groundwater. It came to emerge from a babbling brook located upon the knolls in the northeast of a kingdom called Zion. There, the divine first met man when the shining marble was discovered by a boy, a shepherd by the name of David. David was a young human, a species of hominids descended from the mammalian survivors of the catastrophe millions of years prior. Humans were a curious species, noted for their inclination for expansion, ignorance, and general ingratitude. Nevertheless, what they lacked in tact was sometimes made up for by a propensity for empathy, the arts, and social cohesion. This, however, was not such a case. When David uncovered the sparkling orb from its spot on the shore, what he saw was not a divine treasure, but a potential weapon. This auspicious expedition into the hills was not to herd sheep, as he might have ordinarily. David was going to war. In those days, Zion, a confederation of loosely related Semitic tribes, was at war with the Philistines, a kingdom of settler Phoenicians expanding from the north. The Zionites were terrified of a great Philistine warrior who was called Jalut. David, full of spit and testosterone, had volunteered to duel the brute for the honor of the kingdom. The story goes that David, a future king of Zion, collected 3 smooth stones, including our marble. In the ensuing battle, David prayed and let fly God's favored toy. It's been oft repeated by many celestials that this very David was the apple of God's eye. David is heralded by the heavenly scribes as a man with a love for God so unwavering as to conquer giants with faith alone. He is often held as a prime example of how even mere mortals can feel the warmth of a creator's embrace. To this effect, many psalms have claimed that his feelings towards God were mutual, but the evidence says otherwise. If David were anything to God, and to be very clear, he wasn't, a more accurate depiction of his position would be the marble of God's eye, for as we've established, it is actually marbles that God has eyes for, not men. Ironically, whilst David was not the apple of God's eye, God's marble did put out Jalut's. I often find myself chuckling at the absurdity of it. God's magnum opus hurled by one ape to kill another with blunt force trauma to the head. But that is neither here nor there. The Zionites feasted in celebration, whilst Jalut's carcass was left to rot on the battlefield, the marble still embedded in his fractured skull. Contrary to the popular narrative, this was the closest David would ever come to God. Seizing power shortly thereafter, he built his house upon a creaky foundation. The kingdom of Zion collapsed after no more than 2 generations, leading to a brutal civil war between collections of tribes in the north and south. This was followed summarily by the successive invasions of many other polities. The land of David was marred by centuries of war, and the Zionites suffered many hardships. Under the reign of another empire centuries later, Canaan eventually became known as Palestine, literally the land of the Philistines. In a twist of fate, though long dead, Jalut had finally prevailed. During this time, the exact whereabouts of the marble are unknown. Following the momentous battle between David and Jalut, a poor Phoenician farmer boy by the name of Ahum is thought to have forged the field for any valuable equipment worth selling. In doing so, he plucked the orb from the dead behemoth's skull. However, where David perceived a deadly stone, Ahum found wonder and enlightenment. The child whisked away his precious new keepsake to his home in the hills around Tyre, where it is assumed that the marble was passed down as an heirloom from generation to generation. The marble next appears in the historical record over 2,000 years later. A man called Asar, a distant descendant of Ahum, had come to settle in the metropolis of Salem. Asar was a wealthy trader who often attributed his success to the magic power of a certain stone, a well-kept family secret. These alleged powers were, of course, false, and Asar's level of prosperity would not last. In those days, armed conflict had once again broken out in the land once called Canaan. Followers of 2 long-dead hominids waged petty wars over paltry deities. These were the so-called Yeshuits and Mohammedans. We understand very little of the background of either of these organizations, but are fairly confident that they didn't like each other very much. The kingdoms of Yeshua, naturally found bickering with one another at home, had against all probability united to destroy the perceived threat of their contemporary, claiming Canaan as rightful holy turf. As an interesting addendum, while their perceived differences were marked in blood, both groups were inheritors of the Semitic religious tradition born in Canaan. In fact, the prophet Yeshua is widely suspected to be a direct blood descendant of David, though some accounts may vary. All that said, it's well known that humans would look for any old excuse to kill one another, and this chapter of their history was no different. During the final days of the siege at Salem, Yeshuite warriors breached the Mohammedan defenses, and their forces rapidly spilled into the city. What happened next has widely been panned as one of the more embarrassing moments of human history. The Yeshuites, who had once claimed to be religious pilgrims, viciously sacked the burg, leading to the butchering of some 50,000 men, women, and children. It is said that the city streets ran so thick with blood that the invaders trudged through knee-deep red pools. In the pursuant chaos, a Frankish petty noble called Pierre Dumont joined in the looting. He and his war band had acquired knowledge of a wealthy trader living in the city limits, and took advantage of the massacre to secure wealth for themselves. Dumont is said to have attacked the House of Azar with such vitrolic ferocity that not a single stone was left standing. Dumont personally spit Azar upon his sword, discovering a curious round gem in the folds of the slain man's robes. Once again, God's favorite marble was stained with hominid blood. Like many conquerors before, the Yeshuits' hold on the land of Canaan was tenuous and short-lived. In only 100 years, the invaders were repelled by a collection of Mohammedan Seljuks and Saqqarans. Though the Yeshuits aimed to reclaim the territories for centuries thereafter, they would be driven off time and time again. While they could not hold Palestine, the Yeshuits were not left empty-handed. They returned spoiled with new traditions and goods from the East. These included advancements in mathematics, philosophy, and a taste for trading goods which would eventually lead to a terribly tragic outbreak of disease. In the hubbub, the marble was quietly returned to Dumont's estate in the Kingdom of the Franks, component to his vast spoils of war, where it remained untouched until his death years later. From here, the path again grows foggy. We've attempted our best to piece together the puzzle, but both oral and digital records fail during this period. Most of those tracking the marble's history believe that the toy was passed from generation to generation, similar to the pattern established by Aham before. However, there is a school of thought who believe the marble was lost, stolen, and recaptured by a series of successive warlords. The distinctions between each point are highly technical and, if I'm honest, arbitrary to the overall project. What's important to remember is that the orb's path was random and wildly unguided. In essence, it was hidden from view until it made a surprising return years later. Universal historians were fascinated to discover that their quarry would reappear nearly 1,600 leagues and an ocean away from its Frankish origin point. The marble was found not in a grand palace or a towering museum, but a sleepy town in the south of Appalachia. It's said that the toy found itself whisked away to this new continent on the boats of Frankish sailors, making it an early component to the great injustices wrought by those men and women there. However, I personally estimate that it arrived a good deal after initial settlement, potentially during the second of humanity's great civil wars, or even in a shipping container in the ensuing boom of global trade. What we do know conclusively is that the marble found itself in a tiny pawn shop amongst many other Terran marbles, a divine object on display for mere pennies. It's here that a hominid male called Jean Ray first set eyes upon it. Very little is known of the enigmatic man known as Jean Ray, though we are aware that he was a kind of amateur philosopher. Following the discovery of the beautiful marble, Jean Ray would often find himself pondering on it regularly. He studied it closely, deeply. In many ways, he was the first and only human to appreciate the orb for what it was: divine. Compelled by a feverish, perhaps obsessive, fidelity to the orb, he would go on to write a book developing a game for the object, though his manuscripts have since been lost. Some of my colleagues in the hominid anthropology department have spent several fruitless millennia attempting to decipher the exact rules to this contest. Regardless, Jean Ray would study the marble for years, eventually establishing a hypothesis surrounding it known as the time cube. This theory of cosmology posited that the universe and time had 4 contingent vertices which enveloped Earth's 4-day cycle and the metamorphosis of man from child to elderly adult. According to certain records, Jean Ray was at one time considered the wisest human, though more and more scholars are beginning to doubt the official narrative and believe that this title was designed to be derisive. Jean Ray is famously regarded, even in heaven, for having been the closest a mortal thinker has ever come to an accurate metaphysical mapping of reality. Nevertheless, his musings on the time cube were still fairly inaccurate. Time, as we all understand, is spherical, not cubic. Though it may seem like a minute theoretical distinction, the difference is actually greatly pronounced when applied in an engineering setting. For instance, most researchers would agree that the stages of metamorphosis Jean observed aren't cornered but circular, as karmic rebirth completes the cycle. Reincarnation is a byproduct of the accidental nature of the universe, and some believe it has unilaterally led to the maximization of sentient suffering. For benevolent architects wishing to help rather than hinder their creations, it would be wise to design true endpoints for their world souls, but I digress. For all the fanfare, it should be noted that Jean Ray's prominence in the historical record is likely exaggerated, a mythos perpetuated by his numerous and prosperous descendants. Clan members of his son's line would go on to forge a successful mining corporation years later, an aristocracy greatly interested in drumming up an illustrious origin story. We have a wealth of information on his activity precisely because of this near deific ascendance, perhaps something of a survivor's bias. Jean Ray was, in reality, very lonely. The rise of global digital communications, a limited understanding of science, and a vicious community of skeptics all contributed to his constant isolation and later descent. Jean Ray would die alone and unheard a few years later, the marble tucked neatly into his breast pocket and buried with him. What Jean appreciated, humanity could not. The record notes his persistence and courage in the face of overwhelming criticism. Certain oral traditions hold that House Ray's descendants would go on to become central in the corporate race to colonize the stars. However, before this could be accomplished, humankind would first need to conquer Terra, and tragically, itself. In the intervening centuries leading to the jump, mighty empires rose and fell and great wars were decided with nuclear-tipped arsenals. After eons of a vicious cycle of earthbound annihilation and rebirth, man would finally hobble his way beyond Terra's weary atmosphere. The planet's collapsing ecosystems, finally crumbling under civilization's ruthless assault, would propel the first human colonials into that final frontier, the deadly abyss which God had wrought. Among them, House Ray's wealthy descendants owned and inhabited one of the first starships to grasp at the sky, leaving behind billions of wretched souls trapped on a dying planet. The ship sought to escape Terra's solar system, a testament to man's new covenant with the stars. It will surprise many readers to learn that Jean Ray, or at least his corpse, was present along this grand journey. We've since learned that as the figurehead of a dynasty, his remains were sought out and exhumed by a private archaeological firm hired by noble House Ray, intending to plant his bones on a distant world terraformed to suit its new inhabitants. However, the team discovered far more than they anticipated when they uncovered a little glass orb in the deserts of old Appalachia. From the hills of ancient Canaan to the Frankish plains, onto slow farmland streets, despite all probability conspiring to keep it bound, God's favorite marble was once again free of Terra's grip. We know very little of the specific individuals who carried the marble into distant space. The stories of man's adventures into the unknown are myriad, with a cast of mighty heroes, swarthy villains, and cosmic intrigue set on a galactic scale. After a paltry few thousand years, House Ray would quickly exploit its new planet's resources, and colonists would once more be jettisoned to find a new home. This cycle of settlement, terraforming, ruination, and escape continued for hundreds of thousands of years unchecked, propelling humanity's greedy descendants to the very corners of space. The empire of man stretched across many solar systems, a quarter of the length of the Milky Way, and experienced an unprecedented golden age of arts, technology, and trade. Over time, the name Ray would gradually fade into obscurity as language changed and alliances shifted. The home planet Terra also passed into distant and forgotten memory, a whispered lullaby sung by hominid mothers to weary babies in the cradle. Nevertheless, wherever the descendants of man trod, so too would the marble. We've only managed to capture a few snippets of its spatial record, but have concluded that the orb was never still during this time. Sometimes it found itself in the pockets of Ortegan junk traders from the Outer Rim. At other points, it sat in distinguished capitals of art and culture, like those of Thoros or of Anishheim, an ancient and prestigious artifact, rumored to trace back to the Mother World. Man found itself unmatched, unchallenged, a race of petty gods in a universe supposedly bereft of sentient life. Then, in the midst of this hubris, the end. In my many years chronicling the life and times of the various denizens of this accidental universe, the Shokan have always struck me as uniquely successful creatures. Inheritors of a strange jellyfish-like animal, the species developed into a powerful collection of social hive minds. Though a product of humble beginnings, they proved themselves to be highly industrious and warlike, reaching for the stars a mere 50 million years after their rancid ancestors crawled out of acid seas. Their billion-year domination of the cosmos was one of stealth and brutality. The Shokan were a jealous people. Knowing the dangers of an intergalactic competitor, they would lay in wait for millennia as civilizations developed, before attacking with irresistible force, snuffing sentience out in the crib. Truthfully, if given the chance, I would have preferred to document their civilization over man's, one doubtlessly marked by successes and achievements far greater and more interesting than the slow and inefficient progress of its mammalian counterpart. As it stands, however, the record remembers only humans as the first and last keeper of God's favorite marble. Thus, by happenstance, they are preserved. Man was neither the first nor the last race of proud usurpers to upset the balance of power in the galaxy. Many fledgling species had reached for the skies before, confident in their ability to conquer. Like haughty lambs led to the slaughter, each was met with existential annihilation. But those are stories for a different time. As it pertains to the marble, all that is historically relevant is the fact that the Shokan were a species bred for conflict, and they excelled at their craft. There was war between man and Shokan, brief and terrible, and then there was nothing. The Shokan took no quarter. Any planet harboring but a speck of human DNA was annihilated. Just like that, in a cosmological blink, humanity had ceased to exist. It is here that the distant past meets an approximation of the present. Around the time the last stars began to blink out of existence, I and my colleagues elected to conduct one last archaeological dig before the Guardians closed the door between our worlds. By pure chance, on a desolate planet floating at the edge of Alpha Centauri, we found evidence of hominid settlement, perhaps a humble farm colony or ancient trading post. For several 100 billion years of wear, the little rock of a planet had remained remarkably preserved, with no sign of significant asteroid impacts and little topsoil erosion. Judging by the geological analysis of one seemingly anomalous layer of sediment, something or someone had ignited the planet's oxygen atmosphere many years prior. Concurrent with this were human-shaped fossils in neatly collapsed cisterns, perhaps underground residences built by Shokan survivors. It goes without saying that the find was remarkable for the academic community. Here it was, finally clear-cut evidence of hominid influence light years from Terra, and, even more exciting, possible signs of some sort of galactic war. But this wasn't all. As we bored deeper, a young research assistant of mine struck something hard in the dead silt. With great excitement, our brushes met a small glass orb, gleaming in the artificial cave lights. God's favorite marble was home again. It is at this point that I choose to conclude the story of God's favorite marble. This, I wager, is as good a spot as any to rest my quill. As with all stories, the goalposts are rather arbitrary. After all, from its discovery, the marble went on to persist for an eternity up to the present writing, and had indeed existed in one form or another since time immemorial. I'll take responsibility now and confess that I have not been completely honest with you, dear reader. The misadventure I have just described is not the first time the marble has fallen into the great emptiness below. From the birth of stars to the ascent of life, intelligence, and empire, it has all happened before in an unending circle of birth, expansion, and recession. Over the course of forever, whether knocked, kicked, thrown, or dropped, the marble has wound its way into new universes below our celestial world several million times at least. The statistical probability of these occurrences happening in such a great volume is admittedly slim. I often catch myself wondering, what are the chances? But then I am reminded that probability in eternity is nigh certainty. Man was neither the first nor the last sentient creature to lay hand or paw upon the marble's pristine contours, to touch divinity for a cosmic moment. In fact, when placed in the grand context of the thousands of species to make contact, man's record is staggeringly unimpressive. At no point did humanity unlock the secrets of its philosopher's stone, or even consider the possibility of a vast energy source held in the marble's amber glow, as many have before. The marble remained small and anonymous, virtually forgotten, save for a few select moments. Why then do I choose to limit the scope of an infinitely detailed analysis to such a humble subject? As you might have guessed, this is not the story of a marble, but one of a species. For humankind, my concern is first and foremost one of cycles. Humans never escape the vices which plague them. Expansion, ignorance, and especially ingratitude. Man always saw what it could take, but never what it was given. They lived brutally short lives, which yielded unappreciative demeanors, a pattern we've observed again and again. The land of Canaan, trapped in successive, never-ending wars. Souls in loops of reincarnation laid bare through Jean Ray. The never-ending ruination of colonized planets. Man, in its eternal cycle of incessant hunger and dire greed, considered no philosophical weight and held no final answer when death finally knocked upon its doors. Yet through it all, they had a chance. Enlightenment was always in the palm of humanity's collective hands, an embodiment of the divine, a gift ultimately squandered by a planet of apes. In the end, perhaps this is the essential lesson of history. While humanity has been dead for 1 billion trillion years, it still whispers to the relative few still living. So, to those few mortals afforded the luxury of life and time, heed this ancient warning. Remember always that in the folly of man, one species of an infinite many, we see a cherished alternative. For the moment, God's favorite marble rests on a red velveteen pillow upon a pedestal of chiseled quartz in a palace made of gold, weary after a 1 trillion-year journey across the cosmos. And there, with any luck, it shall stay.